The soft glow of my phone screen reads 2:47 a.m., and I'm lying here in the darkness of our shared bedroom, listening to Edward's steady breathing from the bed 3 feet away. Comment below where you're listening from. I'd love to know if anyone else has ever found themselves in this impossible space between friendship and something more. The weight of unspoken feelings sits heavy on my chest, making sleep feel like a distant possibility as I stare at the ceiling and try to make sense of what's been building between us for months. 8 months of sharing this cramped apartment, 8 months of learning that Edward takes his coffee black but adds honey when he thinks no one's looking. 8 months of discovering that his laugh changes depending on whether he finds something genuinely funny or just socially appropriate to acknowledge. 8 months of catching myself staring too long when he stretches in the morning, his t-shirt riding up just enough to reveal a strip of skin that makes my heart skip in ways I'm still learning to understand. I turn my head slightly, just enough to see his profile in the dim light filtering through our thin curtains. His dark hair falls across his forehead in a way that makes my fingers itch to brush it back, and even in sleep, there's something about his presence that fills the room with a warmth I've never experienced before. The way he sleeps so peacefully, completely unguarded, makes me wonder what it would feel like to wake up next to him not as a roommate, but as something more. The confusion started small, creeping in during those first few weeks when we were still figuring out our rhythm as roommates. Edward would brush past me in the kitchen, his hand briefly touching my shoulder as he reached for a mug, and I'd feel this electric current that seemed to linger long after he'd moved away. I told myself it was just the adjustment period, the natural intimacy that comes with sharing space with someone new. But then the touches became more frequent, more deliberate, and I found myself looking forward to them in a way that made me question everything I thought I knew about myself. "I don't believe in labels," Edward had said during one of our late-night conversations about relationships, his voice carrying that philosophical tone he gets when he's working through complex ideas. "People are just people, you know? Connection is connection. Why does everything have to be defined and categorized and put into neat little boxes?" At the time, his words felt revolutionary, freeing, like he was offering me permission to explore feelings I'd been too afraid to name. But now, lying here in the dark with my heart full of unnamed emotions, his rejection of labels feels like a wall between us, keeping me from understanding where I stand in his world. The worst part is the hope that keeps flickering to life despite my attempts to rationalize it away. When Edward makes dinner and automatically prepares a plate for me, when he remembers that I prefer the left side of the couch during our movie nights, when he looks at me with those intense green eyes that seem to see straight through to parts of myself I'm still discovering, in those moments, I let myself believe that maybe this warmth I feel isn't one-sided. Maybe the reason he doesn't believe in labels is because what we have transcends them, exists in a space too complex and beautiful for simple definitions. But then doubt creeps in during the quiet moments like this, when I'm alone with my thoughts and the weight of uncertainty. What if his philosophy about labels is just his way of keeping me at arm's length? What if I'm reading meaning into casual touches and lingering glances that are simply products of my own wishful thinking? The fear of misinterpreting our connection, of potentially destroying the most important friendship I've ever had, keeps me frozen in this space between wanting and wondering. I shift slightly in my bed, trying to find a position that might trick my mind into sleep, but my awareness of Edward's presence makes rest impossible. Every small sound he makes, the soft exhale, the rustle of sheets when he adjusts his position, sends my heart racing with a mixture of affection and longing that I don't know how to process. The intimacy of sharing this space, of being present for his most vulnerable moments, feels both precious and torturous. There are nights when I catch him watching me, his gaze lingering in a way that makes my breath catch and my skin warm under his attention. But when I try to meet his eyes, to acknowledge whatever passes between us in those moments, he always looks away first, usually following it with a joke or a comment that deflects from the intensity. It's like he's testing the boundaries of our connection while simultaneously reinforcing them, keeping us both in this liminal space where anything feels possible and nothing feels certain. The digital clock on my nightstand ticks over to 2:52 a.m., and I realize I've been lying here for over an hour, my mind cycling through the same questions and fears that have been haunting me for weeks. Tomorrow we'll wake up and fall back into our easy routine. Edward will make coffee while I shower, we'll share breakfast and comfortable conversation, and I'll spend the day analyzing every interaction for signs of something more. The weight of these unspoken feelings grows heavier with each passing day, and I'm beginning to wonder how much longer I can carry them alone. In the darkness, Edward shifts in his sleep, murmuring something too soft for me to understand, and I close my eyes, wishing I had the courage to bridge the space between us, to ask the questions that might finally bring clarity to this beautiful, terrifying uncertainty that has become the center of my world. The morning light filtered through our shared bedroom window, casting familiar shadows across the space we'd carved out together over the past 8 months. Edward's bed sat 3 feet from mine, close enough that I could hear the subtle changes in his breathing, far enough that I could pretend the distance didn't matter. Our apartment had 2 bedrooms, but we'd ended up sharing this one after Edward casually mentioned he didn't like sleeping alone. At the time, I'd agreed without thinking, telling myself it was practical. We could use the other room as a shared office space. Now, watching him stretch languidly as he woke up, I wondered if that decision had been the beginning of everything I couldn't name. "Morning," Edward mumbled, his voice thick with sleep. He rolled onto his side, facing me, and I felt that familiar flutter in my chest that I'd been trying to ignore for months. His dark hair was messy from sleep, and there was something about the way he looked at me in these quiet morning moments that made my breath catch. "Morning," I managed, sitting up and reaching for my phone to check the time. 7:30. Edward didn't have classes until 10, but I had a client meeting at 9. "Coffee?" he asked, already swinging his legs out of bed. This was our routine. Edward made coffee while I showered, then we'd sit at our small kitchen table and ease into the day together. It was domestic in a way that felt both natural and dangerous. "Please," I said, grateful for the excuse to escape to the bathroom before he could see the way I was looking at him. Under the hot spray of the shower, I tried to organize my thoughts the way I organize design layouts: clean lines, clear hierarchy, logical flow. But Edward defied categorization. He was my roommate, my friend, what? The person who remembered I liked my coffee with oat milk and 1 sugar? The person who touched my shoulder when he passed behind my chair? The person who fell asleep on our couch during movie nights, his head somehow always ending up against my thigh? When I emerged from the bathroom, the smell of coffee filled the apartment, and Edward was standing in the kitchen wearing nothing but sleep pants and a t-shirt that had seen better days. He looked up when I entered, and his smile was warm and uncomplicated in a way that made my chest tight. "I made extra," he said, pouring coffee into 2 mugs. "Figured you might need it after staying up late working on that logo design." The fact that he'd noticed, that he'd paid attention to my schedule and adjusted accordingly, shouldn't have meant as much as it did. But everything with Edward felt weighted, significant in ways I couldn't articulate. "Thanks," I said, accepting the mug and trying not to notice the way our fingers brushed. "What's your day looking like?" "Philosophy 101 at 10, then office hours," he said, settling into his chair across from me. "Though I'm thinking about canceling office hours and going to that new bookstore downtown. Want to come with me after your meeting?" This was how it always was with Edward. Casual invitations that felt like more, suggestions that blurred the line between friendship and something deeper. I'd learned to read the subtext in his voice, the way his eyes lingered on my face when he asked. "I'd like that," I said, and his smile widened. "Good. I saw they have a section on design theory. Thought you might find something interesting." The fact that he'd thought about me while looking at books, that he'd made mental notes about what might interest me, sent warmth spreading through my chest. This was the problem with Edward. He was thoughtful in ways that felt intentional, caring in ways that suggested more than friendship, but whenever I tried to examine it too closely, he'd deflect with jokes or philosophical observations about the arbitrary nature of human connections. "You know," he said, settling back in his chair with his coffee, "I was thinking about what you said yesterday. About your client wanting to put you in a box with their brand guidelines. I complained about a difficult client who wanted to micromanage every aspect of a design project, insisting on specific fonts and color schemes that didn't work together. Edward had listened with the kind of attention that made me feel heard, understood. What about it? It's just interesting how people need to categorize everything, you know? Like they can't appreciate something unless they can label it, define it, put it in a neat little package." He took a sip of his coffee, his eyes meeting mine over the rim of his mug. "I think the best things in life resist definition." There it was, Edward's philosophy about labels, the stance that had become both a comfort and a source of frustration. I understood the appeal of his perspective, the freedom in refusing to be constrained by other people's expectations. But I also craved clarity, some kind of framework to understand what we were to each other. "Sometimes definition can be helpful," I said carefully. "It gives people a sense of security, understanding. But at what cost?" Edward leaned forward, animated in the way he got when discussing ideas that mattered to him. "The moment you put a label on something, you limit its potential. You create boundaries that might not need to exist. I wanted to ask him if he thought we had boundaries, if he thought labels would limit us or clarify what we already were. But I learned that direct questions about our relationship made Edward uncomfortable, caused him to retreat behind abstract philosophical discussions. I should get ready for my meeting, I said instead, standing up and rinsing my mug in the sink. David, Edward said, and something in his voice made me turn. He was looking at me with an expression I couldn't read, intense and almost vulnerable. I'm glad we ended up as roommates. I can't imagine doing this with anyone else. The words hung between us, loaded with meaning I didn't dare interpret. This was Edward at his most honest, offering glimpses of deeper feeling wrapped in safe, ambiguous language. Me too, I said, and meant it completely. As I got dressed for work, I could hear Edward moving around the apartment, the familiar sounds of his morning routine. 8 months of this. Shared spaces, comfortable silences, conversations that felt like they were dancing around something neither of us was willing to name. 8 months of wondering if I was imagining the way he looked at me, if I was reading too much into casual touches and thoughtful gestures. The truth was, I'd never felt as comfortable with anyone as I did with Edward. He made me laugh, challenged my thinking, remembered details about my life that even I sometimes forgot. But his refusal to define anything left me in a constant state of uncertainty, wondering if I was his friend, his something more, or just someone who happened to share his living space. Before leaving for my meeting, I paused in the doorway of our bedroom. Edward was still in bed, reading something on his phone, and the morning light caught the angles of his face in a way that made my heart race. He looked up and caught me watching, and for a moment, neither of us looked away. "Have a good meeting," he said softly. "Thanks," I replied, forcing myself to turn and leave before I said something I couldn't take back. Walking to my car, I carried the weight of all the words we hadn't said, all the questions I hadn't asked. Edward might not believe in labels, but what we had felt too significant to remain undefined forever. The question was whether I had the courage to push for clarity, or if I'd continue existing in the comfortable ambiguity he seemed to prefer. The morning coffee ritual had become sacred between us, though I couldn't pinpoint exactly when it shifted from casual roommate courtesy to something that made my chest tighten with anticipation. Edward appeared in the kitchen doorway, hair still mussed from sleep, carrying 2 mugs with the careful precision of someone who'd memorized every detail of another person's preferences. 2 sugars, splash of cream, stirred counterclockwise because you're secretly superstitious, he said, setting my mug down with a smile that lingered a beat too long. His fingers brushed mine as I reached for it, and I caught him watching my reaction with an intensity that made my pulse quicken. "I'm not superstitious," I protested, the same argument we'd had dozens of times, but my voice came out softer than intended. The domesticity of it all, the way he knew exactly how I liked my coffee, the way he'd started bringing it to me in bed on weekends, the way he seemed to catalog my preferences like they mattered, felt more intimate than anything I'd experienced in previous relationships. Edward leaned against the counter, his own mug cradled in both hands. "You also knock on wood every time you mention something going well at work, and you won't walk under ladders." "That's just common sense," I said, but I was distracted by the way the morning light caught the gold flecks in his eyes. He was studying me again with that look I'd been noticing more frequently, like he was trying to solve a puzzle he couldn't quite figure out. "You're doing it again," I said before I could stop myself. "Doing what?" "Looking at me like." I trailed off, suddenly aware I was about to cross a line we'd been carefully avoiding. "Nothing. Never mind." But Edward didn't let it go. He set down his mug and took a step closer, close enough that I could smell his soap and the faint scent of sleep still clinging to his skin. "Like what, David?" The way he said my name, low and questioning, made something flutter in my chest. I wanted to tell him about the way his gaze made me feel exposed and seen simultaneously, about how I'd started timing my morning routine to coincide with his, about the growing warmth in my chest every time he looked at me like I was something precious. Instead, I shook my head. "It's nothing. Just, you look at me sometimes and I can't figure out what you're thinking." "Maybe that's the point," he said, and there was something playful in his voice, but underneath it was an edge I couldn't identify. "Not everything needs to be figured out, you know. Sometimes things just are." There it was again, his philosophy about not needing to define everything, not putting labels on experiences or relationships. It was part of what had drawn me to him initially, this free-spirited approach to life that felt so different from my own tendency to analyze and categorize. But now, standing in our kitchen with the morning light streaming between us and the weight of unspoken feelings pressing against my ribs, his resistance to definition felt less like freedom and more like a wall. "Right?" I said, taking a step back. Things just are. Something flickered across his face, disappointment, maybe, or confusion. But before I could analyze it further, he was moving closer again, reaching past me to grab something from the counter. His arm brushed against mine, and he didn't immediately pull away. "We should probably get ready for work," I said, though neither of us moved. "Probably," he agreed, but his voice was distracted. His hand was still on the counter beside me, effectively trapping me between his body and the kitchen island. "David." "Yeah. Do you ever think about—" He paused, and I could see him wrestling with something. "About how some people spend their whole lives looking for what we have here. This comfort, this understanding." My heart started beating faster. "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've never felt as comfortable with anyone as I do with you. I've never had someone who just gets me, you know? Who doesn't try to change me or make me fit into some predetermined box." The words should have made me happy, but instead they left me feeling hollow. Because even as he was describing something beautiful between us, he was also reinforcing the boundaries that kept us in this undefined space. "Edward," I started, but he was already pulling away, the moment dissolving as quickly as it had formed. "Anyway," he said, his voice returning to its usual casual tone, "I should shower. Don't want to be late for my 9 o'clock class." I watched him leave the kitchen, noting the way his shoulders tensed as he walked away. This was becoming our pattern, moments of intensity followed by retreat, emotional honesty followed by deflection. It was exhausting, this constant dance around something neither of us was willing to name. Over the next few days, the tension only escalated. Edward seemed to be testing boundaries, finding excuses to touch me more often, a hand on my shoulder when he passed behind my chair, fingers brushing mine when he handed me things, lingering hugs that left me breathless and confused. But every time I tried to address it, he'd deflect with humor or philosophy. "You're overthinking again," he'd say when I'd catch him staring, or "Why does everything need a reason?" when I'd question his behavior. The contradiction was driving me crazy. He'd tell me I was the most important person in his life, then insist that labels were meaningless. He'd touch me with a tenderness that felt romantic, then joke about not needing to define our relationship. He'd look at me like I was everything he'd ever wanted, then pull away the moment I tried to reciprocate. I started pulling back emotionally, trying to protect myself from the constant whiplash of hope and disappointment. But my withdrawal only seemed to make Edward more attentive, more possessive. He'd find reasons to stay close, to insert himself into my space, to remind me of our connection. "You're being weird," he said one evening, finding me on the couch with my laptop, deliberately creating distance between us. "I'm working," I said, not looking up from my screen. "You're avoiding me." He sat down beside me, close enough that his thigh pressed against mine. "Did I do something wrong?" The genuine concern in his voice made my chest ache. "No, Edward. You didn't do anything wrong. Then why do I feel like you're pulling away from me?" I finally looked at him, taking in the worry creasing his forehead, the way his hands were fidgeting with the hem of his shirt. "Because I am." "Why?" The simple question hung between us, loaded with everything we'd been avoiding. I could tell him the truth, that I was falling for him, and his mixed signals were tearing me apart. I could demand clarity about what we were to each other. I could force the conversation he'd been deflecting for months. Instead, I closed my laptop and stood up. "I'm tired, Edward. I'm going to bed." "David, wait." But I was already walking away, leaving him sitting on the couch with questions I wasn't ready to answer. Because as much as his refusal to define our relationship was hurting me, I was terrified that pushing for clarity would mean losing him entirely. And even this painful limbo felt better than the alternative of not having him in my life at all. As I lay in my bed that night, listening to him move around the apartment, I realized that something had to give. We couldn't keep existing in this space between friendship and something more, couldn't keep pretending that the tension between us was sustainable. But I also knew that I wasn't brave enough to be the one to force the conversation that might change everything. The conversation started innocently enough. We were both lying in our separate beds, the room dark except for the soft glow of streetlights filtering through our curtains. Edward had been quieter than usual all evening, and I could feel the weight of unspoken words hanging between us like a thick fog. "David." His voice cut through the darkness, softer than usual. "Yeah. Do you ever think about how weird it is that we just fit?" He shifted in his bed, and I could hear the rustle of sheets. I've never had a roommate situation work this well. Never had someone who just gets my coffee preferences or knows exactly when I need space versus when I need company. My heart started beating faster. This felt different from his usual philosophical musings. More personal. More vulnerable. I guess we do have good chemistry, I said carefully, testing the waters. Chemistry. He repeated the word like he was tasting it. That's such a clinical way to put it. Like we're elements in a lab experiment. I turned onto my side, facing his bed in the darkness. How would you put it then? There was a long pause. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. I don't know. I've never felt this comfortable with anyone. Like, ever. With you, I don't have to perform or pretend or worry about saying the wrong thing. You just accept me exactly as I am. The raw honesty in his voice made my chest tight. This was the most direct he'd ever been about our connection, and I felt myself leaning into it despite all my recent efforts to protect myself. I feel the same way, I admitted. Sometimes I think we understand each other better than people who've known each other for years. Exactly. I could hear the smile in his voice. It's like we speak the same language, even when we're not talking. Like when you brought me that sandwich last week when I was grading papers until midnight. You didn't ask if I was hungry or what I wanted. You just knew. You looked exhausted. And you always forget to eat when you're focused on work. See? That's what I mean. You pay attention to me in ways that... He trailed off, and I held my breath, waiting for him to finish. Ways that what? Another pause. Ways that feel important. Ways that matter. I felt a surge of hope mixed with frustration. He was dancing around something significant, but I could feel him pulling back even as he opened up. Edward, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. What are we doing here? What do you mean? I mean this. I gestured into the darkness, knowing he couldn't see me but hoping he'd understand. We live together, we cook together, we talk until 3 in the morning about everything and nothing. You bring me coffee in bed. You remember how I like my eggs. You get jealous when I hang out with other people. But then whenever I try to talk about what any of it means, you shut down. I could feel him tense up across the room. I don't shut down. I just don't think everything needs to be dissected and labeled and put into neat little boxes. But I'm not asking you to put us in a box. I'm asking you to be honest about what's happening between us. What do you think is happening between us? His voice had shifted, becoming more defensive. I think. I took a deep breath, knowing I was about to cross a line I couldn't uncross. I think we both feel something more than friendship. I think we have for a while. And I think your whole philosophy about not believing in labels is just a way to avoid dealing with it. The silence that followed was deafening. I could hear my own heartbeat in my ears, could feel the weight of my words hanging in the air between us. That's not fair, he said finally, his voice tight. Isn't it? Edward, you can't keep doing this. You can't keep acting like we're more than friends and then hiding behind this anti-label thing whenever I try to address it. I'm not hiding behind anything. He sat up in his bed, and I could see his silhouette in the dim light. I genuinely don't believe in forcing connections into predetermined categories. What we have is what we have. Why does it need a name? Because I need to know where I stand with you. The words came out more desperate than I intended. Because I'm going crazy trying to figure out if you're just being friendly or if there's something more here. Because I can't keep pretending that the way you look at me sometimes doesn't make my heart race. David. His voice was softer now, almost pleading. No, let me finish. I sat up too, facing him across the small space between our beds. I've been walking on eggshells for months, analyzing every interaction, every touch, every look. And you know what? I'm exhausted. I'm tired of living in this gray area where I don't know if I'm your friend or something more or just someone you're comfortable with because I don't push for definitions. You're not just someone I'm comfortable with. The words came out sharp, almost angry. I'm what? He was quiet for a long moment. You're important to me. Really important. But that doesn't mean I have to slap a label on it to make it real. But what if I need the label? What if I need to know that what I'm feeling isn't one-sided? What if I need to know that when you touch my shoulder or bring me coffee or look at me like I'm the only person in the room, it means something? It does mean something. It means I care about you. But how do you care about me? As a friend? As something more? Because there's a difference, Edward, and pretending there isn't doesn't make it go away. He stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. Why do you need to quantify everything? Why can't you just let things be what they are? Because what they are is confusing and painful, and I can't keep doing this. My voice cracked slightly. I can't keep hoping that maybe you feel the same way I do while you refuse to even acknowledge that there might be something to feel. The same way you do? He turned from the window, and even in the dim light, I could see the tension in his posture. What way is that, exactly? I felt like I was standing on the edge of a cliff. You know what way. No, I don't. Tell me. Edward, don't make me say it. Why not? If you want honesty, Then be honest. Tell me what you're feeling. The challenge in his voice made something snap inside me. Fine. I'm in love with you. I've been in love with you for months, and it's killing me that you won't even admit there's something between us. There. Is that honest enough for you? The words hung in the air like a bomb that had just gone off. Edward stared at me, his face unreadable in the darkness. David. He started, but I cut him off. No, don't. Don't you dare tell me that love is just another label. Don't you dare minimize what I just told you with your philosophy about not defining things. I wasn't going to. His voice was quiet, almost defeated. I was going to say that you're trying to force me into a box I don't fit into. What box? The box of caring about someone? The box of being honest about your feelings? The box of being someone's boyfriend? The box of traditional relationship expectations? The box of having to define and defend and explain what we are to other people? I never asked you to be my boyfriend. I never asked you to explain anything to anyone else. I just asked you to be honest with me about what you feel. And what if what I feel doesn't fit into any category you'd recognize? What if what I feel for you is something I don't have words for? Then find the words. Or don't use words at all. But stop pretending that nothing is happening here. He was quiet for a long time, and I could see him struggling with something. Finally, he spoke, his voice barely audible. I'm scared, okay? I'm scared that if I admit what this is, I'll ruin it. I'm scared that if I try to define it, it'll change into something else. Something less than what we have now. And I'm scared that if you don't admit what this is, I'll lose my mind. I'm scared that I'm falling for someone who will never let himself fall back. We stared at each other across the small space between our beds, both of us breathing hard like we'd been running. The weight of everything we'd just said settled between us like a wall. I can't do this, he said finally, his voice hollow. I can't be what you need me to be. I never asked you to be anything other than honest. But honesty isn't enough for you. You want commitment. You want labels. You want things I don't know how to give. I want you to stop hiding behind your philosophy and admit that you feel something too. And then what? We become boyfriends? We hold hands in public? We argue about whose turn it is to do the dishes as a couple instead of as roommates. Maybe. Would that be so terrible? He looked at me like I'd suggested jumping off a bridge. It would change everything. Maybe everything needs to change. The silence that followed felt final somehow. Like we'd reached the end of something important and found ourselves on opposite sides of an unbridgeable gap. I need some air, Edward said, grabbing his jacket from the chair by the window. Edward, wait. But he was already heading for the door. I can't do this right now, David. I can't be what you want me to be, and I can't pretend that I don't care about you. So I need some space to think. The door closed behind him with a soft click, leaving me alone in the darkness with the echo of everything we'd just said to each other. I lay back down, staring at the ceiling, wondering if I'd just destroyed the most important relationship in my life by asking for the one thing he couldn't give me, the truth. The morning light filtering through our bedroom window felt different somehow, harsher maybe, or just more honest. I'd been lying here for hours, staring at Edward's empty bed, replaying every word of our fight from 3 nights ago. The silence between us had stretched into something almost unbearable, punctuated only by the careful choreography of two people trying to share a space while pretending the other doesn't exist. Edward had been leaving earlier for work, coming home later, and when we did cross paths in the kitchen or hallway, we moved around each other like polite strangers. The easy intimacy we'd built over 8 months had evaporated overnight, replaced by a tension so thick I could barely breathe through it. Every morning I woke up hoping he'd say something, anything, to bridge the gap between us, but he seemed just as committed to this awful dance of avoidance as I was becoming resigned to it. I rolled over and grabbed my laptop, opening the browser tab I'd been staring at for the past 2 days. Apartment listings. The words blurred together as I scrolled through options I couldn't really afford, places that would take me far enough away from Edward to maybe, eventually, stop feeling like I was suffocating. A studio in Riverside. A 1-bedroom in the Arts District. A shared house with 3 strangers who wouldn't know about the mess I'd made of the most important relationship in my life. The rational part of my brain kept insisting I was overreacting, that Edward and I could find our way back to friendship, that I should just swallow my feelings and pretend the confession never happened. But the larger part of me, the part that had been slowly dying these past few days, knew I couldn't do it. I couldn't go back to analyzing every casual touch, every lingering look, every moment of tenderness that might mean everything or nothing at all. I couldn't keep loving someone who was so terrified of what we had that he'd rather lose it than name it. I clicked on a listing for a small apartment downtown, close to my office, with hardwood floors and big windows that looked nothing like the warm, cluttered space Edward and I had created together. The rent was more than I wanted to pay, but it was available immediately, and right now that felt like the most important thing. I could be out by the end of the week, give Edward his space back, let him return to his comfortable world of undefined connections and philosophical abstractions about love. My phone buzzed with a text from my sister. "How are things with the roommate situation?" I told her about Edward weeks ago, in a moment of weakness when I needed someone to understand why I was walking around like a lovesick teenager. She'd been supportive but practical, reminding me that I deserved someone who could meet me halfway emotionally. Looking at these apartment listings, I realized she'd been right. I started filling out the application, my fingers moving automatically across the keyboard even as my heart protested every word. Current address, employment information, references. The mundane details of starting over, of choosing my own emotional well-being over the possibility that Edward might eventually find the courage to be honest about his feelings. It felt both devastating and liberating, like cutting away a part of myself that had been slowly poisoning the rest. The front door opened and closed, Edward's familiar footsteps in the hallway. I minimized the browser window instinctively, then felt angry at myself for the impulse. I had nothing to hide. If anything, I was finally being honest about what I needed, even if it meant walking away from what I wanted most. Edward appeared in the doorway, still in his teaching clothes, looking as exhausted as I felt. His hair was messier than usual, and there were shadows under his eyes that suggested he'd been sleeping as poorly as I had. For a moment, we just looked at each other across the space between our beds, and I felt the familiar pull of wanting to close that distance, to pretend everything was fine. "David," he said quietly, and my name in his voice still had the power to make my chest tight. "We need to talk." I reopened the laptop, letting the apartment listing fill the screen. Let him see what his silence had cost us. "I think we've said everything we need to say, Edward. You made your position pretty clear." He stepped into the room, his eyes finding the laptop screen, and I watched something shift in his expression. Panic, maybe, or recognition. What is that? What it looks like? "I'm looking for a new place." I kept my voice steady, professional, like I was discussing the weather instead of dismantling our entire life together. "I should be able to move out by next weekend." "David, no." The word came out sharp, desperate, and Edward moved closer to the bed. "You can't just leave. We can figure this out." "Figure what out, exactly?" I closed the laptop and finally looked at him directly. "You've made it clear that you don't want to define what we have, and I can't keep living in this gray area. I can't keep wondering if every moment of closeness means something or if I'm just reading too much into your philosophy about connection." Edward sat down heavily on his own bed, running his hands through his hair. "It's not that simple." "It actually is that simple." I stood up, needing the distance, needing to feel like I had some control over this conversation. "I told you I love you, and you told me you're scared of labels." "That's an answer, Edward. Maybe not the one I wanted, but it's clear enough. You don't understand." His voice was quieter now, strained. "It's not about labels. It's about what happens when we put words to this thing between us. What happens when we make it real." "It already is real," I said, and I could hear the exhaustion in my own voice. "It's been real for months. The only difference is whether we're brave enough to acknowledge it." Edward was quiet for a long moment, staring at his hands. When he looked up, his eyes were bright with something that might have been tears. "I can't lose you." "Then don't." The words came out more raw than I intended. "Don't lose me because you're too scared to admit what we both know is true. And what if admitting it ruins everything? What if putting expectations on this thing we have kills it?" I felt something break open in my chest, a mix of heartbreak and clarity. "Edward, look around. Look at us. We're barely speaking. We're walking around each other like strangers. Your fear of ruining what we have is destroying it anyway." He was quiet again, and I could see him struggling with something, wrestling with words he couldn't quite say. Finally, he looked at me with an expression so vulnerable it made my breath catch. "I don't know how to do this. I don't know how to be what you need. I'm not asking you to be anything other than honest," I said softly. "I'm asking you to stop hiding behind philosophy and tell me what you actually feel. Not what you think about love or labels or definitions. What you feel. About me. About us." Edward stood up abruptly, pacing to the window. "What I feel is terrifying." "Why?" "Because it's too much. Because it's bigger than anything I've ever experienced, and I don't know what to do with that. Because every time I look at you, I want things I never thought I wanted, and that scares the hell out of me." My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. "What kind of things?" He turned back to me, and for the first time in days, he looked directly into my eyes without flinching. Forever things. Commitment things. Things that require words like boyfriend and partner, and all the labels I've spent years avoiding. The silence stretched between us, heavy with possibility and fear. I could see Edward waiting for my response, could see him preparing for me to either reach for him or pull away. This was the moment I'd been waiting for, the honesty I'd been desperate for, and now that it was here, I felt overwhelmed by the weight of it. "Edward," I said finally, my voice barely above a whisper. "What are you saying?" He took a step closer, then another, until he was standing right in front of me. "I'm saying that maybe it's time I stopped being so scared of words and started being more scared of losing you." I watch Edward's face crumble as he takes in the half-packed boxes scattered around our bedroom, my clothes folded in neat piles on the bed we've shared this space around for 8 months. He stands frozen in the doorway, still holding 2 cups of coffee, mine made exactly the way I like it, with that extra shot of vanilla he always remembers. "You're really leaving," he whispers, and it's not a question. The coffee cup shakes slightly in his hands. "I have to." The words scrape against my throat. "I can't keep doing this, Edward. I can't keep pretending that what we have doesn't mean everything to me while you hide behind your philosophy about labels." He sets the cups down on my dresser with shaking hands, and I watch him struggle with something internal, his jaw working like he's fighting to get words out. "David, you what?" The exhaustion in my voice surprises even me. "You don't believe in labels? You think I'm trying to force you into some box? I've heard it all before." "No." The word comes out sharp, desperate. "That's not God. I've been such an idiot." I pause in folding a sweater, my hands stilling on the soft fabric. There's something different in his voice, something raw that I've never heard before. "I've been hiding," he continues, and his voice cracks. "All this time, I've been hiding behind this idea that labels are limiting, that defining things ruins them. But the truth is, I've been terrified." My heart hammers against my ribs. "Terrified of what?" "Of this." He gestures between us, his hands trembling. "Of how much you mean to me. Of how completely you've become everything." The sweater falls from my hands back into the box. "Edward." "I call you my person," he says suddenly, and my breath catches. "When I think you're asleep, when I'm talking to myself, when I'm trying to explain to my sister why I can't imagine my life without you, I call you my person. Because that's what you are. You're my person, David." The words hit me like a physical blow. He knows. Somehow, he knows I heard him. "I heard you," I whisper, and his eyes widen. "That night last week, when you thought I was asleep, you were on the phone with someone, and you said I was your person, that you'd never felt this way about anyone." Edward's face goes pale, then flushes deep red. "You heard that?" "I did. And it broke my heart because I knew you'd never say it to me when I was awake. You'd never let yourself be that honest with me." He sinks onto his bed, burying his face in his hands. "I'm so scared, David. I'm scared of what it means to need someone this much. I'm scared of traditional relationship expectations, of people asking when we're getting married or buying a house or all those things that feel like they're supposed to come with loving someone." "But you do," I say quietly. "Love me." He looks up, and his eyes are bright with unshed tears. "I love you so much it terrifies me. I love you so much that I wake up every morning grateful you're still here, and I go to sleep every night afraid you'll realize you deserve better than someone who can't even admit what we have." My own eyes burn. I don't want better. I want you. I want this, whatever this is. I don't need you to call me your boyfriend or your partner or anything else. I just need you to stop pretending that what we have isn't real. "It's the most real thing in my life," he says, his voice breaking. "You're the most real thing in my life. I bring you coffee because I love seeing you smile when you first wake up. I remember how you like it because every detail about you matters to me. I touch you whenever I can because being close to you feels like coming home." I sit down on my bed, facing him, our knees almost touching. "Then why are you fighting it so hard?" "Because I don't know how to be someone's person," he admits. "I don't know how to be the kind of man who deserves to be loved the way you love me. I've spent so long rejecting traditional relationship models that I forgot there might be something worth having underneath all the labels. You don't have to be anything other than who you are," I tell him. I fell in love with the man who brings me coffee and remembers my favorite books and talks about philosophy until 3 in the morning. I fell in love with the man who's been my person for months, even if he was too scared to say it. Edward reaches across the space between our beds, his fingers brushing against mine. "I don't want you to leave. I don't want to leave either. But I can't stay if nothing changes. I can't keep loving you in secret while you pretend we're just roommates who happen to share everything that matters. What if? He takes a shaky breath. What if we make our own rules? What if we define this thing between us in our own way, without worrying about what anyone else thinks it should look like? What would that look like? It would look like me admitting that you're my person, and I'm yours. It would look like me telling people that I'm with you, that we're together, even if I can't explain exactly what that means in traditional terms. It would look like me being brave enough to love you out loud instead of just in the dark. My heart feels like it might burst. Edward, I know I've hurt you with my fear, he continues. I know I've made you feel like you weren't enough, like what we have wasn't enough. But you are everything, David. You are more than enough. You are my person, and I want to be yours, officially and completely and without any more hiding. I reach for his hand, intertwining our fingers. You already are my person. You have been for months. Even after I've been such a coward about it? Especially then. Because I know how hard this is for you, and you're doing it anyway. You're choosing me anyway. He squeezes my hand. I'm choosing us. I'm choosing to be brave enough to love you the way you deserve to be loved. And I'm choosing to stay, I say, looking at the boxes around us. I'm choosing to unpack these boxes and figure out what our version of forever looks like. Edward's smile is radiant, transformative. Our person forever. Our person forever, I agree, and lean across the space between our beds to kiss him, finally, properly, without fear or hesitation or the weight of unspoken words between us. 3 weeks later, I wake up to the smell of coffee and the sound of Edward humming in the kitchen. It's a Tuesday morning, and sunlight streams through the window of our bedroom, our single bedroom now, with one bed that we picked out together last weekend. The transition happened gradually, naturally, like everything else between us once we stopped fighting it. Edward appears in the doorway holding 2 mugs, and I can't help but smile at the sight of him in his rumpled teaching clothes, hair still messy from sleep. He's been introducing me to his colleagues as his partner now, the word rolling off his tongue like he's been saying it for years. The first time he did it, I watched his face carefully, waiting for the panic or regret, but there was only pride there. Pride in something that looked like relief. Morning, my person, he says, settling onto the edge of the bed and handing me my coffee. The phrase has become our thing now, not a label exactly, but something that belongs entirely to us. It carries weight without the pressure of traditional definitions, and somehow that makes it perfect. I take a sip and lean against his shoulder. How'd you sleep? Better than I have in months, he admits, and I know he means it. The tension that used to live in his shoulders has mostly melted away, replaced by something steadier. I keep thinking about what you said the other night, about how we were already defining our relationship through our actions. I remember that conversation, one of many we've had since everything changed. We'd been lying in bed, talking about how his fear of labels had actually created its own kind of prison. You were already calling me your person, I remind him. You were already bringing me coffee every morning, already planning your days around mine. I was an idiot, he says, shaking his head. All that time I spent worried about boxes and definitions, when what we had was already so much bigger than any word could contain. I set down my coffee and turned to face him fully. You weren't an idiot. You were scared. There's a difference. He reaches up and touches my face, thumb tracing along my cheekbone. I was terrified, he corrects. When I saw those apartment listings on your laptop, when I realized you were actually going to leave. He trails off, but I can see the memory of that panic in his eyes. I'd never felt fear like that before. It was like watching my whole world collapse. But I didn't leave, I say softly. I'm here. You're here, he repeats, like he's still getting used to the miracle of it. And I'm done hiding behind philosophy when what I really want is right in front of me. We've been having conversations like this almost daily, working through 8 months of unspoken feelings and missed signals. It's not always easy. There are moments when Edward's old habits surface, when he starts to deflect or intellectualize instead of just feeling. But he catches himself now, apologizes, tries again. The effort he's putting in means everything to me. I have something for you, he says suddenly, reaching into his nightstand drawer. He pulls out a small wrapped package, looking almost nervous. It's not much, but I saw it and thought of you. I unwrap it carefully to find a simple silver keychain with 2 interlocking circles. It's understated, elegant, nothing flashy or obvious. Edward, I know we don't need symbols or grand gestures, he says quickly, but I wanted you to have something that represents us. Something that says we're connected, we're committed, without having to fit into anyone else's definition of what that means. I turn the keychain over in my hands, feeling the weight of it. It's perfect. Really, really. I lean over and kiss him, soft and sure. I love it. I love you. I love you too, he says, and the words still feel new and precious between us. My person. Later, after Edward leaves for his morning classes, I walk through our apartment with fresh eyes. The boxes are gone now, my belongings integrated seamlessly with his. My art supplies share space with his books. My coffee mug sits next to his in the dish rack. The second bed has been moved to the living room, transformed into a reading nook where we spend evenings curled up together. On the refrigerator, there's a photo from last weekend. Edward and me at the farmer's market, his arm around my shoulders, both of us laughing at something one of the vendors said. We look happy. We look like we belong together. My phone buzzes with a text from Edward. Told my students about my partner today. They want to meet you at the department mixer next month. You in? I type back. Absolutely. Your person wouldn't miss it. The response comes immediately. Can't wait to show you off. See you tonight. Love you. I smile and slip the phone into my pocket, the new keychain jingling softly against my keys. Outside, the world continues its complicated dance of definitions and labels. But in here, in the space we've created together, we've found something simpler and more true. We've found each other, and we've found our own way of being together that honors both of our needs. Tonight, Edward will come home, and we'll cook dinner together, talking about our days and making plans for the weekend. We'll fall asleep in our shared bed, and maybe I'll wake up to hear him whisper my person in the darkness, thinking I'm asleep. But this time, I won't pretend. This time, I'll whisper it back.